so I need to zip back to get to that. I've held magic in my hands. From the first moment 25 years ago, when I came to Arena, I was blessed with a top-notch production staff, board, and dynamic administration. I will miss many staff members and senior staff members and artists, but mostly I think I'll miss the board, which is fascinating to me, who I've had great conversations with and arguments with and created magic with. At Arena Stage, we can create anything. How many of you have been to Arena? Yay, okay, so you know. Theater artists love to work at Arena because their dream on paper can be realized down to the smallest detail. Designers, directors, actors have come to Arena and created magic, achieved amazing feats and built their dreams. We have many of the best craftspeople, artisans, and administrators in the country, and we make the magic happen. I've been able to create magic by putting together teams of artists to create beautiful works on stage. During technical rehearsals, I've been able to ask for a new prop, and voila, within hours it's delivered to me. I've seen the looks on the faces of children as they see themselves reflected back to them. Now, when we're talking about theatrical magic, there's no shortage of examples. Arena's recent production of Ride the Cyclone was chock full of theatrical magic in the middle of an amusement park. I think of the costumer Marty Paklademus, who dreamed up how the dresses and petticoats would spin for Oklahoma at exactly the same level from the ground so that we would all have the optic of spinning umbrellas. Visual magic. When watching from the seats of the Fitch Handler in the round space, because as you know, you're looking down in that space as if you're in an operating room, right? The amazing airplane in Catch Me If You Can that was built by the stewardesses and by the flight attendants. Frumacera, the ultimate nightmare dream in Fiddler on the Roof, who arrived through an invisible hole in the bed to a magnificent 12 feet high and scared everybody to death. Costume designer Emilio Sosa, his stunning Day of the Dead creations in Senor Discretion himself. Intricate custom beading on Ma Rainey's dress in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, August Wilson. Katrin's death fall in Mother Courage and Her Children. Flying an orchestra above the set for Carousel. People disappearing and reappearing in the Fantastics. A set of sand and plastics for our most recent production of Angels in America, representing the passing of time like in an hourglass, and the ashes of all the dead from the AIDS epidemic. We all know it's been a challenge coming back after the pandemic, and it's not because artists aren't eager and just as creative, if not more so, but because there have been seismic shifts around us. There have been a lot of discussions about what audiences want, what the right projects are, and from this moment of learning, I see a common thread. Audiences have changed. People have changed since COVID. We didn't know how they would change, but we knew they would, and we're in this time where it's difficult to find the right path. The whole field experienced being drastically closed, and drastically closed in the way that almost no other field was closed, because we're about the live event in front of you. And during that time, conversations were flying about the future of the American theater. Indeed, our whole system was destabilized. There's a reckoning of the American theater. A few things are pretty clear. We all want to be taken on an adventure. We want fantasy. We want to be immersed in the world of the play. We want to really be taken out of our everyday life and taken to a place of imagination. So I want to take you way, way back before we go forward. Intrepid icons like Nina Vance, Zelda Fitch Handler, Marco Jones, Tyrone Guthrie, Gordon Davidson, among others, created the not-for-profit resident theater system of theaters almost 75 years ago. Let's bring them into the room now. Let's remember them, because that was a revolution. This desire to create theater in one's own hometown instead of going to commercial theater in New York, instead of waiting for touring productions, real indigenous theater, created out of one's community and authentic to that community. That's what these pioneers wanted to create. Well, they created it. We have now over 1,200 theaters nationwide. It's a revolution that has been won. And I've been wondering, so what's the next revolution? Well, I think we're in it. I think we're in it right now. Discussions about pay scales. We see you, white American theater. Intense discussions around equity, diversity, and inclusion to new ways of gauging success and progress. Generational shifts and stress between the millennials and the boomers. Sharing power, the hashtag #MeToo movement. Different hours of work to flatten hierarchical power structures. We're in it. And I believe it will take us 10 years to fully achieve a time of symmetry. Right now, all the theaters are rocking and rolling as if we're in the middle of a hurricane. But as theaters, we have to always keep moving forward, right? Making decisions that will help our theaters survive until we can thrive. Yes, 10 years. Does that scare you? Well, it should scare you and energize you at the same time, because there's something about being in the middle of a revolution that's pretty exciting stuff. And there's so many ideas right now, and that's partly why people are having a hard time really speaking about it in a concise way. In time, I think we'll have fewer critical incidents that are rocking the theater, and we'll be able to see the path more clearly. But right now, sadly, many in the theater world are eating each other, turning their angst about the world inside instead of pushing outside to the world to have the conversations there. That is our purpose, after all, to reflect the world. Climate change, race, America's complicated and frightening history, the continuing struggle between young and old, the clash between right and left. So many subjects to discuss better on our stages rather than eating each other alive inside of our organizations. And I think it's time to put these ideas into our work and reflect the world back to itself. Now, out of this chaos often comes ingenuity, because I also see the brilliance of new voices and new ideas coming from every part of the field. This desire to communicate and make a difference in each community. I believe in the resident movement of theaters. I'm a child of it. I looked up to the first generation of leaders like Zelda Fitch-Handler and Bob Brustein. I'm really part of the second generation. And now we're the group passing the baton to the third generation. I've been saddened when I look around the country and see new artistic directors taking over theaters with a burn it down attitude, instead of a let's build this attitude. Let's build on it. There's so much to change in the theater, in each of our houses, but without a recognition and understanding of a particular theater's history, how can one go forward? How can one actually take the audiences and the artists who have been with the theater for years and often decades forward if the new artistic director doesn't fall in love with the present and the past history? One of the areas I believe we improved at Arena Stage is our relationship to our community. This includes our neighborhood as well as our local and national artistic communities. Before the creation of the Arena Stage at the Mead Center for American Theater in 2010, the board and leadership was debating how to improve the facility and where the best home for Arena would be. I was taken by the idea of finding a vibrant new neighborhood. Southwest at that time was dreary, drab, the forgotten quadrant. Arena's American brutalism architecture looked more like a modest suburban library. Oh, somebody's phone just went off. Pretend you're in the theater and turn your cell phones off. It was a reflection of that time period, and Arena was at its own crossroads. So what we did is we dug into the neighborhood instead of leaving. We kept the landmark theaters and created that beautiful space. How many have been there since we changed it? Almost everybody, right? So you know, creating that beautiful space around them, embracing them, hugging them, giving them new life. And the neighborhood responded. The developers reacted with creating more buildings and the wharf. And now look at it, completely unrecognizable from 25 years ago. Now, I don't particularly like developers, and I'll tell you why. Because developers are only about developing. They're not actually about helping and supporting what's just happened. So developers use all their assets, and then they either move on or barely give you a couple $1,000. So I'm not a fan of developers, although I kind of love what's happened down in Southwest Washington, right? Forgotten quadrant, and now we're the hottest area of the city. From Safeway to the fish market. Was that also magic? Yes. Magic that took 12 years of my career and a lot of other careers, including Steve Brailov's, to make happen and to explode. Magic. As Zelda Fitzhandler said, the new center, it's the 8th wonder of the theater world. We now have 3 theaters humming happily together and a staff of 120, toiling under a heroic 450-foot cantilevered roof. There's an electrical charge through this center we created for American theater and American artists. So let's go back a little bit and dig into deeper collaborations, heightening the experiences, wants, needs of younger artists and audiences. Because I think highlighting artists of color and women is a path to the future. There's so many voices out there yet to be heard. This fall, I created something called My Body, No Choice, 8 monologues by women about the impact of laws and rules on our bodies, the sovereignty of our bodies. And I created this in reaction to what happened with Roe v. Wade, because I was angry, I was obsessed, I was upset, I was, oh my God, we have to go through this again. But this project with these 8 monologues, you could say it was for women, and it was, but it was also for men. Wouldn't it be men that need to hear these stories more? Men needing to understand the impact of these decisions that mostly men make? One of our male board members commented that he'd done his own research, he'd read all the newspapers, he'd spoken to his wife, but when he experienced the stories of the women on stage, it hit him in the gut. And he will never see the sovereignty of women's bodies in the same way again. That's what theater can do. Pow. And over 30 universities and theaters all over America in red and blue states responded with readings in their own communities in the run-up to the midterms, where abortion drove votes, even though most of the pundits didn't think it would be a factor. Well, it was and it is, right? Arena's embarked on a multi-year partnership with Step Africa, one of America's finest African-American dance companies. Their blend of percussive dance styles practiced by historical African-American fraternities and sororities with traditional African dances and an array of contemporary dance creates an exciting artistic experience. Now, does that seem like an odd pairing? It wasn't. It's been fabulous. Step Africa brought a huge whoosh of energy, and Arena's traditional audience has been as enthralled as Step Africa's own audience. Everybody comes together for experience. Everybody is welcomed into the experience. Radical rethinking is required. Connecting to the community is not a one and done activity. Impact comes after many activities along the same through line. So when Arena opened the Mead Center, and that was in 2010, we had a homecoming day. The entire building was bursting with activities, free activities from morning till night for all ages and dispositions. What a great day it was. Magic. We've done a variety of activities within our building. We've had open houses, props, and costume sales, over 12 job fairs with thousands lining up to find work in the DMV. A crowning achievement was being a mass vaccination center during the pandemic, and over 15,000 people were vaccinated. It doesn't stop. It cannot stop. So I've given some Arena examples, but what's the radical rethinking? Well, it's not just an open house, it's a vaccination center. And kudos to Edgar Doby, who's our executive producer, for seeing that and answering the call of our city government to make it happen. More of that radical rethinking is needed. Not just the content we provide as theater organizations and theater makers, but how do we recognize that what we have is a magical resource that can buoy the whole community. So to be at the helm of a great and adventurous American theater means tackling really big ideas. My first big idea was to focus on American artists, American ideas, and American stories. And there were lots of people at Arena that didn't want us to go in that direction. Because of course Zelda Fitzhandler had a focus on Eastern European work and classical work because she had a big company of actors. Doug Wager then started moving into some new work and some musicals, and when I came, we went like an arrow toward American work. But actually what I said to people is, you know what? Audiences are going to get it that we are going into American work because that's all they're going to see here. And if they really want to see the classics, we have 70 theaters in this city. There are a lot of theaters that focus on the classics. There's lots of places you can go. My second big idea was the reimagining of the gold standard musical. Now, how American can you get, right? The gold standard musical. It stood the test of time. It's muscular in its approach to storytelling, music, and dance. Now, the darker side of these musicals becomes apparent because they mirror the sexism and the prejudice of the times when they were written. Many eras were not the good old days for everyone. I found 3 specific ways to reinterpret these wonderful musicals for today's cast audiences. Number 1, casting. Number 2, action and interpretation. Number 3, line changes with the consent of the writers or the estate. You can't really change the lines unless they let you. So if anybody tells you, oh yeah, you can just move the lines around. You can't do that. You get what's called a cease and desist. You don't want that. And because we live in a world of multiple experiences, races, genders, religions, cultures, and more, I want my work to reflect that world and allow it to illuminate the material that I'm exploring. So I've always been a proponent of cross-cultural casting throughout my career as a director and artistic director for the past 45 years. So before I was at Arena, I created Perseverance Theater in Juneau, Alaska, and ran that for 19 years. So it's a small theater on the edge of the world. It's a way of working for me in terms of this cross-cultural work. It's been with me my whole career. For example, in Oklahoma, we were the first theater to cast a Latino-American actor as Curly and African-Americans as Lori and Aunt Eller, in addition to creating an ensemble filled with actors from varied racial backgrounds. That was in 2010. Now there's not a theater in America that would consider producing a majority white production of Oklahoma. They won't do it because of that production. During the days of the Bush administration in Camelot, we cast the Knights of the Round Table as coming from all continents, including Asia and Africa, because it was clear that Arthur needed knights from the whole world, just as we need leaders from the whole world today gathering around a round table. And in My Fair Lady, we were the first production to have Asian Americans in the roles of Eliza Doolittle and her father. In terms of acting and interpretation, the first gold standard musical I directed at Arena was South Pacific. And I staged the overture to set up the conflict between the Native Islanders and the US military, touching on this whole area of colonization. That happened in 2000, over 20 years ago. Because our production of Cabaret happened during the Iraq War, we were able to draw connections between the violence and cruelty of the Nazis in the 1930s and how America's Bill of Rights was actively being threatened in 2006. In directing Anything Goes, I looked at the SS American ship as a microcosm of America, and we cast actors of color in principal roles in the production. And we looked for ways to give the Asian roles of Luke and John, 2 roles that are racially insensitive, more power within the world of the play, making them more complex and realistic characters rather than stereotypes through their physical action on stage and adding them into scenes they hadn't been in previously. Okay, so we produced this in 2018. It was written in 1934. What's racially insensitive today was not in 1934. So we had really frank conversations with the two men, John Weidman and Timothy Krause, who had done a revision in 1987 about the problematic lines in the script. And you know what they did? They helped us rework lines in the script, supporting new character interpretation, thus changing how Luke and John are represented on stage. And the changes that happen at Arena are now part of the score and part of the script that is sent out by the publishers for production all over the world. Yeah, really cool. So there's so much magic in being able to reinvent these gold standard musicals. Is it easy? No. We had some really complicated conversations around this. You can imagine with the actors, a cross-cultural company, coming face to face with the kind of racism that was in the script, and then helping to move the writers into making some of these important changes. My third big idea was the creation of the Power Play cycle. Power Plays is an ambitious commissioning initiative, developing 25 new plays and musicals from a diverse mix of writers, composers, and lyricists taking on America's stories of power and politics, exploring the people, the events, the ideas that have helped shape our country's narrative and identity. We have one story per decade since 1770 through the 2010s, and these are works that show America at its best and at its worst. And it's been great to bring audiences in to experience the work. I just saw a run-through yesterday of Exclusion by Ken Lin, and this is about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which many people don't know very much about. And it doesn't take place in the 1880s. As a matter of fact, it takes place right now in Hollywood with a young, wonderful scholar who's writing about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Hollywood takes her work and Hollywoodizes it into a kung fu movie, right? Which was not what it was at all. So it's all about who gets to tell the story, and indeed, how does she get to tell her story and take her own story back. So it's kind of fantastic. But Power Plays really started with Camp David. Did anybody see that in here? A few people did. Okay, good. Lawrence Wright wrote the book on that, and the gestation came from Jerry Rafshoon, who was the former director of communications for Jimmy Carter. And he connected with Larry about writing a piece around Carter and the Camp David Accords, and he asked Arena to commission it. To say this is one of the most important stories we staged is a complete understatement. I was delighted to be able to interview President and Mrs. Carter about their experiences at their home in Plains, Georgia. They attended opening night, which was almost like a state dinner at Arena. And I also, they were sitting right behind me. Both of them had tears streaming down their cheeks after the show. It was truly a landmark experience. In this city at this time when our legislatures are deadlocked, it's important to be reminded when people from very different cultures, religions, and perspectives sat down to forge an agreement that lasts to this day. It took fire and metal to create the document, and here we are still only 90 miles away from Camp David, where once upon a time politicians risked their lives and careers to create a lasting peace agreement. So I have great hope that this proves it can happen again. Another favorite of mine was Snow Child, a musical with the novel of Eowyn Ivey. And because the wild expanse of my home was Alaska for almost half my life, it remains a retreat for me from the heady politics of DC. I knew there was something that the audiences would be eager to experience in this wildness. It's a classic fairy tale with a mystical feel. It's perfect for the stage. But because this musical is about the relationship between man and the environment and the westward movement of America, it's psychologically a power play. Always moving west, right, and northwest. Sovereignty by Mary Catherine Nagle brought forward the Native American story in an important way. Americans are remarkably naive about Native Americans and Native American culture. And Sovereignty is about a world most Americans know nothing about. That makes DC and Arena the perfect home to premiere a play about treaties, broken treaties, and the deep relationship between Indian country and the US government. We have over 300 treaties that were made between the United States and Indian country. And do you know how many of them have been broken? Every single one of them. Every single one of them, right? Mary Catherine's play asks the question, how far would you go to protect your family and your people? And an audience member grabbed me afterwards and said, I'm an educated person. I feel ignorant, so I fact-checked you during intermission. And the play was correct. I need to keep learning and thinking. Pow. Lives change. We made magic with these plays because magic, as we all know, needs to be created through action. So one of the things that I talk to people about sometimes is, in this kind of radical rethinking, what would happen if we do something in our own imaginations here if there were no paintings, no music, no designer clothing, no interesting furniture? Nearly everything was created by imaginative artists, even the mundane pencil holder. There's not innovation without imagination. Remind people that art is literally core to everything, and that's important. So when that happens, it's magic. So where am I going next? All the stories I've just told you, we created in groups. And I'm looking around at you, and I know a number of you are retired too. So as I began looking at my own chapter after I retired from Arena in just 2 months, I somehow knew I wanted to return to a solo journey as an artist. About a year and a half ago, I returned to something I did 50 years ago at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, pottery. I've always peered into studio windows with a certain longing as I looked at the pots. And instead of waiting until I retired to trundle into a studio with all of my tools, I thought, gee, why not now? What would happen if I decided after I retired that I hated it when I walked in the door? Instead, I began early on this journey of self-discovery. So I sat down at the potter's wheel and began, and I realized I remembered absolutely nothing from 50 years before. But with wonderful teachers, I began the process of throwing pots again. I love the speed of the wheel, the act of centering the clay. I drive a Mini Cooper with a BMW engine, and it moves quickly because it's a little sports car. I've always loved speed. Of course, centering the clay and throwing a pot is definitely a Zen activity. It grounds me. From the shaping of the walls to the hard leather drying process, and then using the tools to trim and carve off the excess, you keep shaping, shaping, shaping what you're creating. Then it's over to the kiln for misfiring, then glazing and firing again in a super hot 2,000-degree kiln. The other day I watched the kiln master open a brick in the kiln, and a burst of fire shot out as he stood there with his goggles on looking in. Alchemy. I love each step, and I've got a beginner's mind about the process. I'm a novice, and it feels good to be a beginner after I've been an expert all these years. As I imagine how I'll shape or glaze a pot, I find a similar excitement to directing a play, and wonder how something I've created will come out of the final firing for glaze. It takes at least a few months from first throwing a pot to finally being able to take it home, not unlike a rehearsal process. For now, my whole career, my job as a director has been working with groups, but now this is that solo activity, so what's next? What's next? I'm learning more about myself as an artist and pursuing pottery. I sort of fell in love with plates because my partner Suzanne wanted a set of dessert plates, so I set about making 18 for Christmas this year. Although each one is different, the repetition of the creation of the shape is like when you first work as a director. Learning over and over again how to stage, how to work on design, how to work with actors, how to work with writers. Of course, I'm already obsessed, like I am when I'm directing, wondering how the pots are drying, if any will crack, dreaming about the various glazes I might use, the combinations of glazes, how to trim something so it's polished and earthy at the same time. I have held magic in my hands. I'm so fortunate to be a theater maker. We have the ability to reach hearts and minds directly and indirectly. Like with a piece of clay, we suggest, shape, touch, embrace, and yet the clay could break in the kiln or be dropped in transit. Rogers and Hammerstein said, "How do you hold a moonbeam in your hand?" We create the moonbeam, we hold the moonbeam, we share the moonbeam, and we let it go. Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own. But release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free. I have held magic in my hands at arena stage, and now it's time to let it go and pass the baton to Hana Sharif and the next generation. Thank you.